My journey as a Superman fan started with a tattered red cape blowing in the wind. That ending rocketed me forward like a red-blue blur through a decade-long origin story and poignant tales of self-discovery and now fatherhood, and backward to the character's very beginnings. Now, on this podcast, we journey together across time and media to examine the stories that have defined the Man of Steel. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the classic animated series Super Friends, specifically a selection of Superman-centric episodes, is returning guest Jeremy Frutkin. Welcome back.
Anthony, a wise man once told me, I get by with a little help from my super friends. And here we are, once again, in the saddle, with a very interesting animated look at Superman and his, super friends.
Yes, well, thank you for joining me for this. You were, of course, on the show for an epic 5-episode run. At the beginning of 2022, we did our Superman the Animated Series mixtape episodes, which were very well received. You became a fan favorite guest right away, which I love.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
And
appreciate you.
You and I have plans next year to apply that same approach to the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited cartoons. But in the meantime, I got this itch that I just had to scratch to delve at least a little bit into the Super Friends animated series. So thank you for joining me for this.
Whenever I don't watch a Superman-related cartoon show with you, Anthony, I start getting a little shaky and a little itchy myself. I agree. Why make people wait? Why make each other wait? This is out there. I think we're going to have a lot of fun looking at the Super Friends. Side note, the group of friends I grew up with, my best friends, always affectionately called ourselves the Super Friends. So I know a bunch of them listen to this podcast as well. So shout out to Patty, Bruce, Will, John, and Bruce for being a Super Friends. They're going to get a real kick out of all of that. So this is kind of an extra special meeting for me today as well.
That's awesome. I was aware from some Facebook posts. I remember seeing that.
Yep.
Now, just to sort of set the table for our audience, I'm sure there are plenty of people listening to this who grew up watching the Super Friends and have a lot of memories and a lot of affection.
Yes.
You and I are not in that category for the most part. We really came into this pretty fresh and cold. So, audience, just keep in mind stuff that might sort of be old hat to you or old news for you. It's new to us. And so we're kind of going to be exploring this together. But we touched on this when we did our Superman the Animated Series mixtapes, but just to kind of catch everyone up, what, if anything, was your experience with the Super Friends prior to this episode?
I knew them as part of what my generation considers a campy zeitgeist, kind of, right? I knew them. I had an old Aquaman Super Friends t-shirt. I saw some random clips here and there. I knew a lot actually from Adult Swim cartoons where they would pull clips sometimes and characters in like Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, when they had the whole Hanna-Barbera license. So I knew just in passing from that, but this is the first time I really sat down in earnest and watched the Super Friends. And without bearing the lead too much, overall, I'm glad I did. Overall, I'm still glad I did.
Yes, I'm glad you said that. And for the audience, in case anyone was like, "Oh, are these guys going to come in and just dump on the show?" No, I don't. That's certainly not the intention.
No.
I, like you, really got a lot out of this viewing project, and I came away from it with a lot of affection for Super Friends. And more than anything else, I totally see now why this resonated with an entire generation of fans. And even for myself, watching it as a 35-year-old man in 2022, there was a lot about it that I really loved. And there's a connection to something from our childhood that I want to talk about in a second that made me love it even more. But I'll just say for myself, and we had talked about this when we did the Superman episodes, like you, I think we had similar views of what it was. I mean, I remember catching the occasional rerun on Cartoon Network as a kid.
Sure.
And that was about it. But could I say that I watched it regularly? No. And, this was in the 90s. It wasn't like I necessarily had access to, a full listing of episodes and description. Like, I just didn't know that much about it. It was like whatever I happened to catch. And yes, certainly the sensibilities were a lot different than what I was watching in the then budding DC animated universe from Bruce Timm. Having just revisited the Bruce Timm animated universe and now Super Friends, I think both subjectively based on our experiences growing up, but also objectively looking at them now with fresh eyes, I do still think you and I grew up in the golden age of DC animation.
I firmly agree from you trying to be as objective. And of course that's impossible, but trying to be as objective as we can be. I think that's completely accurate. I think it's a complete accurate statement. To kind of give a nice little lead in here, we just talked about off air that I'm a big video game fan. I think most of our listeners also know that as well too. I was lucky to be born as the same time as the original NES, right? The original Nintendo. And stick with me here. I promise I'm going to loop this all around. That how I feel about the NES, where so many incredible video game franchises got started. I'm talking about, Mario to a greater extent, Zelda, the first Final Fantasy, Metroid, Kirby. They all got their start in that era. That alone makes it incredibly historically important. However, all of those games and properties have been done better since then. And that is exactly what I feel about the Super Friends. I think they're historically incredibly important and they're worthy of study, even though I think it's fair to say, as objective as we can be, that it's been done better since then.
I think that's a very fair assessment and a natural one, right? I mean, with all of these things, when we're talking, especially with these superhero mythologies, how they build upon one another. And certainly over the course of this podcast, I see that, time and again. So,
sure.
I think in a lot of ways, it definitely paved the way for what was to come. And one of the things because this was educational for me, both viewing the episodes, but also reading about it. And in terms of what we watched, I'll give the full list in a second, but essentially you and I watched about 18 stories. So sometimes it was a full episode, other times it was a segment from an episode, but about 18 stories. And I'll give the list in a minute. But I also did some research primarily on Wikipedia. And you know what Michael Scott from The Office says about Wikipedia? Wikipedia is the greatest thing in the world. Anyone can write anything on any subject, so you're getting the best possible information.
This is why you're the world's best boss, Anthony. You know what I mean? World's best boss. That's it.
But I think Wikipedia was was correct here, so it's all right. But
amazing.
The thing one of the things I was so surprised by was how long it ran. Because in my head it was just sort of like generally like, oh, it was the 70s or 80s, but it ran from 73 to 85, and there were a couple of gaps here and there, but still you're talking a 12-year span. Now, in that time, they did less than 100 episodes, so most of the seasons were on the short side, but for over a decade, especially when it comes to animation, I mean, this was it. I mean, it was the introduction to these characters for, again, a whole generation of fans. And really was, a steward and carried the torch for these characters and the DC universe for such a long period of time. And yes, there was other stuff going on at the time. I mean, the Adam West Batman series had ended, in the 60s, of course. But during the run of Super Friends, you had the Wonder Woman television series. And then, of course, the Christopher Reeve Superman movie. So it's not like there was nothing else going on. But again, for those Saturday mornings for all those years, it's like you think about all of the kids and adults who were exposed to these characters and really came to love these characters from the show. I really came to appreciate that in my research and viewing.
Any time that it's going to be the very first time a generation sees these larger than life living legends that are part of our modern mythology come to life, so to speak, you want to treat it with that respect and that lens, just inherently. And this is so cool to think that this is really, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least at large, the first time that we've seen in this format, the Justice League or Super Friends, I should say, coming together, which I think is absolutely incredible to me. And it must have completely blown people's minds, right? Back then, seeing them come together. And I mean, this is so far behind where we see what the Marvel movies have exploded with the Avengers and everything like that. Back even when we were reading comics in the 90s, the Avengers were nowhere near the popularity that they are now. And I think there's something still to be said about that magic, right, with Justice League and that Super Friends, because when you have such iconic individuals like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Flash, all franchise mythological just champions. You walk down the street, people know who they are regardless. And it's been that way for, oh goodness, some of them going on close to 100 years at this point, right? Like we're getting there as time flies by. There's something so magical for the first time seeing them in motion, come together. How are they going to, and they're all friendly. They don't really have too much bickering or too much problems. They're super friends after all. But it's so magical to see them together as a team for the first time. And I really try to put myself in that perspective back then. That really must have been something special.
I don't want to undercut any of that, but there had been the Filmation animated shows. They had done a Batman show and a Superman show, and then there was an Aquaman segment. And there was like a proto version of Justice League. So there were Filmation cartoons that featured the team, but not to this
grandeur
level
and scale. Got it. For sure. Yeah.
But I do think, and I will be covering the Filmation stuff on the show probably next year. So we'll get there, folks. But I'm sure that in large part helped pave the way for, again, just as, all of these things sort of, they stand on the shoulders of what came
That's
before.
what's been the cool thing about this journey we've been on, right? Through all these different decades, we really see how they do build and connect to each other, even when you think that they might not.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of interesting.
Totally. And on that note, and I know I say this in a lot of episodes, but it's true. I mean, this was a gap. This was definitely a gap in my fandom. Like I said, my knowledge was very superficial and my experience with it very minimal. And now, I mean, would I go so far as to say I immersed myself in the series? That might be stretching it, but not by much, because we watched episodes basically from, we didn't select anything from the first couple of seasons, and we could talk about that, but
sure.
But from virtually, I mean, every other season there was at least some episode or segment that we watched. So I think we got a good sense of the long view of the show and the evolution of it. And we watched a good bunch of episodes. So, I mean, I feel like I have a good sense of it. And you and I were talking off mic. There will be a couple of opportunities down the line on this podcast where, maybe we'll go back to Super Friends and explore maybe some non-Superman-centric episodes. But I mean, I definitely feel like to a large extent, this is a gap that I've closed in large part. And that's always a great feeling. This was, again, I really found myself, because I didn't know if this was going to be going to feel like a chore or what. And I ended up really looking forward to my viewings. Like, how was it for you getting through these 18 stories that we watched?
It was an adjustment at first. If I'm going to be completely just honest, and I always, for better or for worse, I'm completely honest with you and our audience, it was an adjustment at first to be like, wow, okay, different time, different era. And then I was like, okay, I appreciate it. Even still, as we were going forward, and I just said this to you off mic, and I'm going to say the same thing now. As we were getting to the end, it started wearing on me a little bit, if I'm being completely honest with you. I still have, it ended up coming full circle around. Actually, the very last Superman one we watched really kind of brought it back around for me, which I actually thought was pretty cool. So they did some great work overall. But, overall, I have such a healthy appreciation. I guess the word is respect for this show that helped pave the way on such a grander scale, I should say, than has come before. So I enjoyed it. I'm glad I did it. And it made me want to go run and read Justice League comic books right after. So it definitely did its job all these years later.
Gotcha. You know what's so funny? I not to speak for you, I feel like I came away from it with a little bit more affection towards it than you did. And I think this was the key for me. So look, first of all, different sensibilities, different pacing, different everything, right? And these were definitely made for kids in that period of time, and they're relatively simple and sometimes hokey stories, right? But I came to find them, and I kept coming back to this word, comforting. There was something about it. And maybe what's funny too, is I said to myself, I feel like if I had done this viewing project when I was, 22 or 25, 10 years ago, I feel like I would have been like, oh, this is a stupid kids cartoon. I don't like this,
Sure.
But I don't know, after, between becoming a dad and all of the turmoil that we've seen in the world over these past couple of years, I don't know what it was, but there was really something where I was like, I know that over the course of this episode or segment, there'll be some kind of inciting incident. Things will get bad. It'll seem like all hope is lost, but it's always going to work out. There's always going to be some clever twist, and it'll all be fine. Look, we love Superman, the animated series, but there was never any danger that a character was going to get Omega beamed to death on the show, or that there was going to be any state execution on the show, right?
And for anybody listening, I'm still not recovered from that, but yes, it's a very valid point for sure.
There was something very comforting about the formula of it that I just kind of fell into. And I don't know too, like I was watching virtually all of these at night, like kind of, on the later side. And I don't know, there was just something that
bedtime stories
that put me
comforting bedtime stories.
Bedtime stories that really put me at ease. And then what fully unlocked this for me. Okay. So again, you and I are the same age. We grew up watching a lot of the same stuff.
Yep.
So a colorful group, clearly classically heroic, no real infighting, personalities, and I don't say this in a critical way, but personalities largely interchangeable, with the exception of the adult versus the teen characters. Otherwise, personalities are largely interchangeable. A cool headquarters, really awesome toys that tied in to the show, different lineups and different series titles every year or so. What does this sound like to you?
Mm-hmm. Sounds like some of our favorite Justice League stuff, huh?
I was going to say Power Rangers.
Power Rangers. I always thought you were talking about the Justice League to Justice League Unlimited.
No.
Wow.
Power Rangers.
You brought it to Power Rangers. Interesting.
And that's what unlocked it for me. And I was like, because look, audience, if you have, I don't know, 10 years or more on us, you probably grew up with Super Friends and not with Power Rangers. And you were a pet, right? You watched. Oh,
who was it, man? Who wasn't? My buddy just sent me and my now wife a picture of me wearing I should send it to you. Of me wearing the Red Ranger helmet a couple of years ago that we found. We were cleaning out his house. Of course, everybody our age, I think for the most part, is a Power Ranger fan.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And so, I love that show to death as a kid. And so when I sort of made that connection, I was like, oh, I get it. I don't have the affection for this from having watched it as a kid, but I know what it's like to watch something very similar to this.
That's a very, very good point, because my criticisms too go both ways, right? Because I think that's true, but also like, the Green Ranger is trying to play a flute that looks like a sword through his helmet. There shouldn't be sound coming out. That's me nitpicking. But that's the Super Friends is full of things like that. And I don't know if we're going to get to it or not, if I should hold this or not, but there's things like when Mixie kidnaps Batman and Superman, and he disorients Batman by having him hang upside down. And he goes, oh no, I'm dizzy. I'm upside down. It's Batman. What are you doing? He's getting dizzy by hanging upside down. He's Batman. This is ridiculous. So, but that being said, again, as much as I can nitpick, the heart and the soul of both Power Rangers and Super Friends is something comforting and even inspiring in a way. Right. So I see both of our views being true, which is you kind of just click that for me as well too by saying that. I think
it really unlocked it for me. And look, Superman is our primary focus here, though we'll obviously talk about the other characters, especially Batman and one key episode in particular. But this is a very, very simple, classic, quintessentially heroic take on Superman. He's Superman and he does what Superman does. And there's no real conflict internally within the team, anything like that.
Great Scott,
Right? He just goes off and he does what he needs to do. And, is that necessarily the most interesting or compelling take, especially watching it as an adult? No, but I think it's worthwhile to have those versions of the character out there.
I don't know, Anthony. He wildly abuses time travel, which we'll get to. Like wildly. Maybe that's why that was one of my favorites. But he just straight up just thought of himself and messed up the entire space-time continuum. It was some real Flashpoint before Flashpoint. You know what I'm saying? Yes,
we will get to that for sure. But for a second, I just want to go back to the episode you mentioned, the Mixie's Mixie's Revenge,
Anthony.
right?
It was killing me, Anthony.
when he kidnaps Batman and Superman takes him to the fifth dimension. My favorite part about that episode, probably my favorite part about that episode is when Mixie shows Superman kryptonite and Superman's like, we're in the fifth dimension. This doesn't work on me. And Mixie goes, yeah, but these green beans do. And he's like, it was so funny.
It's absurd. And all kids hate their vegetables, I guess. That probably killed with like a bunch of kids, right? Yeah. I'm sure that killed with a bunch of kids. It's preposterous.
I don't want to make this a theme because I said this when we did an episode on the Supergirl movie a little while back. But again, I don't get high, but I feel like if you did, this show would be real fun to watch. Don't you think?
100%. And I bet you, especially during the time period this came out, there's a big cross section of kids and probably like teenagers to young adults who probably both enjoyed this show very much.
Yeah. Again, I like I said, I don't want to make this a theme or like I'm advocating it necessarily, but I just feel like that would take it to a whole other level.
Fam. Do you?
Yeah, for sure. So, like I said, thinking about it in terms of Power Rangers really, like I said, just enhanced my appreciation of the show generally, but also what it meant to so many people. And one huge advantage I think that it does have over Power Rangers really followed a very set formula. You knew the villain was going to grow, and you knew the Rangers were going to summon their Zords, and at most...
There were going to be putties at some point, right?
Yeah, and it's like, at most, maybe the Megazord would run into some trouble, and they would have to call in the Dragon Zord or Titanus, and they would have to merge into Ultra Zord or something like that. But for the most part, even if that happened, you still know that that's in the cards. But with these episodes, it was like, you knew there was going to always be some out. But I don't know about you, but there were ones that I was like, I don't really know how this is going to shake out. A perfect example, the last episode that I watched and the latest episode in the series, the second to last episode, the death of Superman. Obviously, that was going to be on our list.
Yep.
And, Superman seemingly dies from kryptonite poisoning. His body launched into the sun. It's a world without a Superman. And the Super Friends go to the fortress to clear it out. They don't waste any time, mind you. This guy's body's barely even cold, and they're already...
It's like, I'm the executor of the will. All these toys are mine now.
It's great, but they go to the fortress, and the moment right before the act break, the commercial break, is Superman walking towards them. Now,
yes, that's a great cliffhanger. By the way, I thought that was great.
It's a great cliffhanger. Now, look, knowing pre-crisis Superman, I'm like, okay, a robot's going to be involved here, but I didn't know. I said to myself, well, most likely the person walking forward is the robot. And that's what turned out to be the case. But I was like, well, maybe the robot was actually the one who seemingly died. And that was all a diversion. And he was programmed to mimic death. And Superman needed to hide. I didn't know for sure. And that's what made it interesting.
I think that was my favorite Superman, Super Friends episode that we watched. I think that one did a really good job of telling a good cohesive narrative, but also, like, you're right, blending in those elements where you're kind of thinking like, I mean, we know he's going to be okay, right? That's not the trick. The trick is how you get there. Right. And that figuring that out, I think is the fun of that episode. Yeah, no, that they did some good stuff. Like most art in general, and just like DC animation as it's gone over the years has gotten better. The Super Friends show to the superpowers, to the Galactic, to everything, I felt like got better as it went along as well, which I think you make a good point when we kind of were at the top of the show here. Is that's usually how it goes, right? It's how it should be. Things get better with more time, practice, and adjustment. So I think the show does definitely improve as it goes along.
Yes, and I think that's also one of the benefits of being on for over a decade.
Sure.
And not only are the people involved learning and growing and getting better, but again, I think sensibilities change. And I think you definitely see, I don't know that there would have been an episode even called The Death of Superman in any of the 70s seasons. But as we get into the 80s and we can, kind of shake it up a little bit more, you get that. So yeah, watching that evolution was fascinating. So, all right, let me lay out the episodes, and I'll do this as like a lightning round, so I don't want to bore people, but I want to let them know what we watched. And also, so for anyone curious about how we made these selections, once again, I went to Wikipedia, greatest thing in the world. And I looked at
anybody can edit it.
Anyone can write anything. So you're getting the best possible information.
That's exactly right.
One of my favorite quotes. So I read through all of the episode descriptions, and I, made note of all of the ones that seemed the most Superman-centric, since this is ultimately a Superman podcast. And I feel pretty confident, as we go through the list, listeners, if there's something that you're like, wow, I can't believe you guys didn't cover that, please let me know. Okay, this is me cutting into the recording from the future for just a moment here. After Jeremy and I spoke, I actually came across a relevant season 1 episode that we missed called The Planet Splitter. See, for all of our joking about Wikipedia, it actually did let us down in this one respect. So season 1, The Planet Splitter. The premise is that there is a scientist who's looking to crack open this other planet in order to obtain its resources. And at a certain point along the way of this 45-minute season 1 episode, Wendy and Marvin recount to the scientist the origin of Superman. And so you get to see unfold in animated form on screen Superman's origin, the destruction of Krypton, Kal-El's arrival in Smallville, and his adoption by the Kents. So it's always cool to see the origin unfold. Notably, this is the first animated appearance of Jor-El and Lara, which is noteworthy. And what I was particularly struck by, what I really found interesting, was during the part of the proceedings where poor Jor-El, this poor guy, can never catch a break, is trying to convince the council to build spaceships to get the people off of Krypton. It turns out that the council is opposed to the idea of interstellar travel generally, because apparently at some point in the past, they were challenged. And the idea was that those who challenged them tried to usurp their authority by exiling them into space via spacecraft. So that's why they're so opposed to this idea of building a fleet of spaceships, which I thought was an interesting piece of this. So in any event, I'm sorry that we missed the Planet Splitter in our discussion here, but there's so much for us to cover. Thank you for indulging me in this brief interruption. And now back to the show. I even watched a few extra here and there, and if there's an opportunity, I'll mention those. And then you and I did also throw in the episode, the Fear, that retold Batman's origin in the show, which was fascinating to watch.
Loved it.
So, reading through all the descriptions, like I said, I didn't include anything from seasons 1 or 2, and reading more about those seasons, primarily in those first couple of years, the Super Friends were always fighting, like aliens or mad scientists, or there were natural disasters. They didn't really tap into the larger cast of the DC universe. So none of those episodes made it in. And I put on the pilot episode just to kind of watch it. And yeah, it was pretty slow going. And those first season episodes were an hour long. I mean, 40 minutes without commercials, but they were long. That's
long. That is long. I think the show's at its best when, well, I shouldn't say that, because I did really enjoy the death of Superman and the Batman-centric episode we saw. I love those. But I think those two aside, I felt like some of my favorite moments were the ones that were labeled on our wonderful spreadsheet that said segment.
Yeah.
When you can get those quick little 8 to 10 minute hits of like a concise little story. I thought some of those actually ended up being my favorites in that format.
Dude, same. And that was one of the other things that I was surprised by, was the variety in terms of length and structure of these episodes. Because like I said, at least the first season, they were hour-long episodes, and then they shifted to half-hour episodes. And over the course of the series, it changed. Sometimes it was, one story told over the half hour, split into, two with an act break, but still it was one story over 2 episodes. And then other times there were either 2 or 3 segments. And I'm with you, especially for a show like this with its simpler sensibilities and slower pacing and all of that. I really did come to appreciate an 8 or 10 minute, hit there, as opposed to 20 minutes.
One of my favorite, my wife and I, both of our, one of our favorite shows of all time is Adventure Time. I don't know if you or anybody who listens has any. If we have any Adventure Time fans who listen to the podcast, please shout me out and let me know. Once we got married, the first song that played when we got married was the end credits to Adventure Time, because to this day, that's the show that always plays when we're going to bed. We want something peaceful and happy. That show is a half-hour show, but it's split up into 2, works out to be 10 to 12 minute episodes. And those formats in the hands of a good storyteller can be so precise and impactful. I think maybe that's also why I gravitated towards those segments, because when you have that time constraint, it really forces something magical to happen, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So I selected the episodes that were most Superman centric, or segments from episodes.
Yes.
And then we further divided them into buckets, very much akin to what we did with Superman, the animated series. So we have a category for Bizarro and Mixie episodes.
We're not calling them mixtapes though this time. We're calling them buckets.
Well, this whole episode is, I guess, a mixtape. I don't know how you want to call this.
That's true.
Oh, speaking of Mixie, big pet peeve I had. It's Mix Spitalik.
Yeah. And so I was going to just defer to you as the resident expert, but if there's one thing I learned, they weren't doing that right, correct?
I don't know the entire history of the pronunciation of this. I know certainly by the time we got to the animated series with the sadly the late Gilbert Gottfried voicing.
I'm holding up a glass right now. Yes, rest in peace, Gilbert Gottfried. I messaged Anthony right away as soon as I heard that news after our mixtape journey on that. So rest in peace. What a tremendous talent.
Absolutely. I echo that. And in that episode, famously, in that Superman the Animated Series episode, he goes through this whole bit explaining the pronunciation, Mixia
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so that's always how I've said it and how I've heard it said in subsequent iterations. But on this show, they go with Mixelplick, which I've heard other comic book fans say. And I've always, I'm so sorry, but bear with me here, but I've always kind of looked at that as like, I don't know. The poor man's pronunciation is like, you don't figure out how to say
were those fans maybe older than we are? Did they learn it from the Super Friends?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think I have to amend what I had felt previously, because I was always like, oh, you're missing the point here. But I think you're right. I think especially if you grew up watching this, I totally understand why you would say Mixelplick. So anyway, but it was so jarring to keep hearing that. I'm like, that's not how you say it.
And we had that whole beautiful, I mean, a bunch of episodes, about one episode in particular in Superman the Animated Series, where he goes through that whole rant, like you mentioned too, which I actually wonder now, was that a little bit of a nod or a shot to this show too, now that I'm thinking of it?
Maybe. And then we also have buckets for Darkseid. Lex.
Buckets, it's just not as sexy as Mixtapes,
I know.
Buckets.
I know, you're right. But what the other thing that was interesting, again, how these tellings echo each other was the fact that we basically created the same categories as we had before. And
I was shocked but pleasantly surprised too that the marriage of Mixie and Bizarro was alive and well decades before we got to it. I was like, wow, that's actually really cool. What a nice thread that kind of connects both of these shows, that they are so intertwined in this series as well. I thought that was awesome. I've been so excited to talk to you about that.
Yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised by that too. I was like, oh, they line up in very much the same way.
Yep.
Even, when we get to the Darkseid episodes, Darkseid looms very large in the last couple of seasons of the show.
Yep.
And in those last couple of seasons, Superpowers they were now the Superpowers team, and that was reflected in the title.
These name changes, they kill me though, Anthony. They do. It's just constant name changes. It hurts me. But it was bad enough in the beginning with the flip flops between the Super Friends and the Justice League. It's just like, choose one and let's go down that road. I'm sure there's a behind the scenes reason for that I'd be very interested to learn what that reason is. But I just, starting from there and then just in the later seasons, just changing and rebranding. It was a lot, and the names got less and less catchy, I feel like, as we went along.
Oh, you didn't love Galactic Guardians?
But it reminds me of Peter Quill when I hear that. That's going to be no good for them. We don't want that. That's the other team. What are we doing here?
But it's like this. It's like Power Rangers. I mean, I don't know how far you watched on this. I think there will be a Power Rangers podcast at some point.
I was just going to say, surprise, this is the backdoor pilot for the Power Rangers podcast.
But with Power Rangers, the first few seasons were Mighty Morphin, and then it was Zeo, and that's when I stopped. I stopped with Zeo, during Zeo. But then after that, it was kind of like every year it became something else. So, like I said, it's just another parallel between Super Friends and Power Rangers.
Absolutely right. An angle I hadn't considered. That's a good point. It's a good point.
As far as the names, though, so I don't know if this was from Wikipedia or elsewhere, but I think with Super Friends, I mean, it is more kid friendly, so maybe that had a lot to do with it, as opposed to why they didn't go with Justice League of America. I mean, when you look at their communicators, they say JLA on them, so it's not like
that killed me though. It's like, why have both though? Like, there had to have been some kind of internal struggle, right? And this was their compromise. I don't know, but it certainly seems like that would be the only explanation for this, right?
I mean, I think one of the things I read somewhere was, especially in the post-Vietnam era, there was a little bit of wariness about leaning so heavily into the America of it. So maybe that.
Wow, that's a good angle I hadn't considered. Yeah,
So I'm not positive about what went on behind the scenes with this Hanna-Barbera production, but in any event. So let me just run through the episodes so people know what we watched. So again, some of these are segments and some of these are entire episodes. So Revenge of Bizarro, when Bizarro turns the Justice League members into Bizarros and uses red kryptonite on Superman. Bizarro World, when Superman and Black Vulcan are stranded on Bizarro World, and again, red kryptonite comes into play.
How about that?
Mixelplix Revenge is going to drive me nuts. I'm just going to say Mixie because that's less offensive to me.
That's what I've been doing to keep the peace, in case you haven't noticed. That's my way of being neutral like Switzerland here.
It's also easier to type, because
sure.
As I'm looking at my list here. So, Mixie's Revenge, the one we talked about before when Batman and Superman are trapped in the fifth dimension. The Bizarro Superpowers team, where Bizarro and Mixie team up and create Bizarro copies of the Justice League. In our Krypton category, Rokan Enemy from Space. This Kryptonian pterodactyl that
you're really going to make me start with the Super Friends versus Puff the Magic Dragon, Anthony. That's really where we started with here, huh?
I know. Terror from the Phantom Zone, where we have 3 Phantom Zone villains, not Zod, Non, and Ursa. But
again, not another similarity,
always,
right?
It's never them.
Amazing.
I know. And anyway, they escape the Phantom Zone. They use red kryptonite on Superman. It turns him into an old man. The Evil from Krypton. We get another Phantom Zone escapee who's General Zod in all but name. And
we've seen that before too, kind of, haven't we?
We sure have. And he turns the sun red. The Krypton Syndrome, that's the time travel one where Superman prevents the destruction of Krypton, not realizing that there might be some repercussions. We'll go back to all of these. I don't mean to make it sound like this is I'm exhausting the discussion here. I just want to lay them out for everybody. And then Return of the Phantoms, when the 3 villains escape, and this time they go to the past and they try to kill Superboy. Very interesting. All right, now
I know you love that one, Anthony. I know that was, if there's one thing you love, it's just Superboy flying around Smallville, I'm
gonna listen, by the time this podcast series is over, I'm gonna love Superboy one way or the other.
I love the determination. You'll love to see it.
Gonna love it. All right. So the dark side category here, the Wrath of Brainiac. Brainiac and Darkseid team up. No Honor Among Thieves. Luthor and Darkseid team up. Darkseid's Golden Trap. He tries to use gold kryptonite on Superman. I like this episode. And the Death of Superman, which we talked about.
Yes.
Then in our Lex category, we got a lot to talk about with Lex. Wanted, the Super Friends. This was the first episode of Challenge of the Super Friends featuring the Legion of Doom. This was a key episode. Luthor creates this dream machine that allows him to control the Super Friends while they're sleeping and they commit crimes. It's great. History of Doom, real fascinating one.
Very interesting.
This post-apocalyptic world, Earth, that aliens visit, and then they watch the memory tapes to see what happens. And
what a great cold open on that one, huh?
So good. It was so good. And we get to see the origins of a number of Legion of Doom members, particularly Lex. And Lex Luthor Strikes Back, where Lex escapes from prison and turns the sun red. And this was a Lex very much in the mold, in a lot of ways, of the Gene Hackman version from Superman the movie. So you get to see now how that's starting to influence the cartoon. Fascinating. And then I call this a Superman category, but I mean, they're all Superman episodes, but I didn't quite have a different category for these. But Universe of Evil, where Superman switches places with his evil counterpart from an alternate universe. And One Small Step for Superman, where this young boy can't walk, doesn't think he'll ever walk, and Superman basically creates an opportunity where the boy has to walk in order to save Superman, and that's what allows him to break through.
You gave the summary to that episode much more positively than I was going to. Mine was going to be Superman lies to child for the greater good. But yes, I guess that's also accurate.
So that's the lightning round of what we covered. And after this commercial break, we will break it all down. So we'll be right back. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated full-service comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. Since 1983, this 9-time Eisner Award nominee uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material available. They pride themselves on their significant contemporary and vintage back-issue selection. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available to anyone, anywhere, via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I was fortunate enough to have my work shown at these festivals, and I found them to be very enjoyable and well-run events. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news and updates about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and currently under new ownership, Moose sells a wide selection of new and old comics from every publisher, action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP, that's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions, to save 10% on your order, and it helps support the show. Thank you. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Skokie, Illinois, Muncie, Indiana, or Harrison, New York, which happens to be my local comic shop. If you have kids and are looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Aw Yeah. And we're back. You know, one thing that I always love to ask you in particular, as an actor, as a performer, is about the vocal performances in these animated series. So I'm just curious with Super Friends, just, you know, generally or specifically, what stood out to you?
So it's so funny because obviously I'm not as well versed in the stars and the notable names of that time period as I would be, you know, the area we grew up in or now or anything of that. But I thought it was so cool that Casey Kasem did the voice of Robin. And I always, you know, we always make the jokes, holy, you know, so-and-so Batman, you know, again and again. I never really put 2 and 2 together. That was Casey Kasem doing this, who I know from obviously, you know, just the radio and DJing and a variety of things. So I thought that was really a kind of a cool connection. And even as of an era as that was, I even thought his little enthusiasm, like we talked about earlier, there are definitely 2 different types of Super Friend, right? The adults and the teenagers. At least with Casey Kasem's performance, it was something different, right? When he brought a certain energy to it, which I thought was kind of cool. And, you know, I'm going to shout out, I feel like the Superman podcast, we're shouting out Batman a lot in this one, but Adam West, who I don't know if we ever talked about this, but I actually met at an AppleCon in New York when I was in college, probably like 10, close to 15 years ago. He couldn't have been nicer. He called me Smallville. He made that nice joke, which I thought you would appreciate because he knew I was a big fan of everything and then that genre and was acting all buddy. Great guy, class act. It's so cool to see him in this role, especially in that Scarecrow-centric Crime Alley episode that we talked about, and something a little more serious with a little more gravitas. Because when we always think of Adam West Batman, at least for me, I think of the Bat-Tusi and the giant bombs and the cartoonish. So I thought it was cool that he not only got to continue doing this role, I didn't really fully appreciate and understand how long he was Batman for, if you really think about it. And I thought that was such a cool and wonderful performance, and to see it kind of get a little more nuanced ever so slightly as time went on as well.
So if I'm not mistaken, he did not do the voice of Batman throughout Super Friends. I think
he came in later, right? Yep.
But yeah, no, exactly to your point, the fact that, you know, he was able to come back and, you know, even with that break in between, you know, continue on. So cool. Yeah. I mean, what's funny is certainly with Batman and Robin, they're very much the Batman and Robin that audiences would be familiar with from, you know, from the Adam West TV show, which again, I know that's another one of those things that for a certain generation, that's a huge and an entry point into the character for a lot of people. Even with all of the campiness, I know there's a lot of love.
Cesar Romero, man, come on.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, it's just never been a part of my fandom, so that doesn't necessarily do much for me. But again, I can still appreciate it. And I believe Danny Dark was the actor who voiced Superman throughout the run. And again, just a very, you know, very classic, like quintessential.
Yeah, he was fine.
Take
he sounded, like the classic Superman voice is if we were to put a bow on it, right?
We mentioned now a couple of times the teen character. So of course there's Robin, and you know, so when we talk about the changing lineups, sort of the core group is always Superman, Batman, Robin, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and then other characters come and go throughout the life of the show, and you know, pretty much at every point along the way, there's some, you know, younger hero teen contingent Now, we bypassed the Wendy and Marvin years, and I don't believe they were particularly well received.
You know, one of my dogs is named Marvin. Sidebar. I can't claim it's after that, but fun fact for anybody listening at home, now that I will ever think of him as a Wonder Twin because of this experience. So, and
then we get to the Wonder Twins, who were there for, a good bunch of the episodes we watched. Generally, what was your take on the Wonder Twins? Did you find them annoying? Were they charming? Was it just sort of like par for the course?
I'm really trying not to have such like a good cop, bad cop routine here with you and me with this whole thing. There's a lot that I really came to enjoy and respect. Like I said, I think I made that clear enough at the top of that. The Wonder Twins in the show is not one of them. It was too much. It was just straight up too much for me. And not even, sure, it's of an era, it's campiness, it's silly, they're supposed to laugh at it, sure. It just was so nonsensical. And I thought even like their powers to me are never clearly defined, right? Like they put their rings together and like one can only make ice and one can only make animals. Is that it? Like, I don't even understand. And why is the monkey there? It's not a monkey. It's an alien. Gleek's an alien.
Yeah.
It just was so unclear. This is going to sound silly because I'm saying I dislike them. Right. But if they just gave us like not even an episode, like an 8 to 10 minute segment, maybe there was one there. We didn't watch all of them.
Right.
Maybe there was. For all I know, there is. If I watched something that helped me explain and understand them a little better, maybe that would help. But based on how we watched through our buckets, if you will, that I could not care less about the two of them. I felt like they never really contributed anything of major significance to the story, except for showing up to maybe run interference once in a while a fight was going on.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially for the episodes we watched. And maybe there's some Wonder Twins gold out there that we missed. I would be surprised.
And let us know, please. I want to enjoy everything and appreciate everything. So if there is something we missed in any medium about the Wonder Twins, shout us out on social media. Let us know, because I would be interested to turn this page around for something, because this just didn't do it for me.
I hear you. I wouldn't go so far as to be like totally good cop on this. I guess I didn't find them as grating as maybe others would, or as I even expected to. I was just sort of like, all right, like I get the shtick. What's funny though is that they feel so unnecessary. It's like, it's such a kid-friendly show to begin with.
Right.
And Robin's there. It's like, I don't know that we necessarily
What do we need? The kids are already relating to everything. We don't need, it's just not necessary.
I think that was more my takeaway than anything else. In recent years, they did the Wonder Twins series at DC. I didn't read it, but this was, I think, when Bendis did his whole, I think it was like the Wonder Comics imprint that he had at DC, and there was Young Justice, and then there was Wonder Twins, and there was an adaptation of them in Smallville. Do you remember from, I think it was season 9?
Yes, vaguely, but yes, I do remember them popping up.
Yeah, with Simon Camden from Seventh Heaven. He played Zan.
How about that? Keeping it in the family over there for the WB, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, that was one of my main exposures to the characters, was through that. Again, not the most memorable Smallville episode, but they did, they did do a version of them. It's one of those things I wonder, for you and me in particular, and you especially.
I like the play on words you just did there too, but go on.
Ah, yes. But I question whether, like, let's say this movie is really good.
Sure.
Right. I wonder, I can't get away from it. I wonder if then you would go back and watch these and feel differently, right? If that's able to create, something compelling for you that allows you to sort of like latch onto the characters in a more significant way.
I don't think it, at least for me, I don't think it would. I think I'd be like, oh, whew, they finally figured it out.
Yeah.
It is more of like a relief is what I would feel.
Fair enough.
And now the Wonder Twin fans are going to come for my head, but that's fine. I'm prepared. I'm ready. But I would love to know if there's anything I'm missing. Please let me know. I'm legitimately curious and interested. I want my opinion changed.
There you go. But nicely, people. Remember, nicely.
That's right.
So the other thing is, we're talking about the younger characters. I definitely was much more a fan of, in the final seasons, we had Cyborg and Firestorm. So we had younger characters, but from the DC universe, and not played for laughs. They weren't comedy relief.
The big difference. Yeah. Yep.
Now, one huge gripe though. What the hell are Firestorm's powers in this show?
Anthony, it might as well just be like, he's magic. They might as well have just said that. He's just, and we both know, at least to some degree, I'm not a firestorm expert, but like he transmutes chemicals using scientific properties. That's part of the whole thing where in some iterations where he's spliced with Professor Stein or whoever it may be, right? Like that's why that's interesting, because they're using that power of knowledge, which I think is really cool, to be honest with you. That's a cool angle. But this is just like, he's just turning things into different things left, right, and center. He's going intangible. He's just, it's crazy. I don't know what his powers are supposed to be.
So you're right. The way it plays in most of the episodes we watched with him, it seems like he can transform anything into anything.
Yeah.
And it really does feel like it's
matter transmutation is what they would call it. Right.
Right. And it really feels like it's more magic based than science, because I agree with you. Certainly, you know, in the comics, the whole idea, like you said, is that he is formulating these chemical equations. Like he needs to know the compounds that he's changing.
Which is a great also message, I think, and would have been a great message for kids, that knowledge is power as well, too. You think that would have been a layup, right? Hey, look, he studied hard. He knows his chemistry. And now look at him kicking butt all across the DC universe, right?
Now, I was getting very curious about this. So I actually watched, though it wasn't on our list, but I watched the first episode that he appears in.
Okay.
And I think it's the second to last season. Oh, quick side note. We haven't really been talking about the season numbers, so this isn't really a huge deal. But I think it was the 78-79 season. I'm not 100%, but I think that was the season where there were basically two versions of Super Friends that were aired together. And Challenge of the Super Friends with the Legion of Doom was the second half. On HBO Max, they split them into seasons 3 and 4. So I think if you look under most listings of the show, including Wikipedia, you'll find 9 seasons. Or series, really, since they had different titles. But anyway, 9 seasons. But on HBO Max, there are 10.
And I don't think we mentioned this yet, but for anybody listening, they're all 10, like you just said, are on HBO Max. So if you were expecting a Tubi plug, sorry. But this one, credit goes to HBO Max. They are all on there. So it's if you have HBO Max, you have access to go check out what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, HBO Max, just like Tubi, not a sponsor of this podcast. But look, I dump on the DC app a lot because there's significant gaps that are really
DC Infinite, sure.
Yeah, really living up to that name there.
Yeah, right. No kidding.
But I really feel like there are unacceptable gaps, especially looking at the characters that we're talking about here and the large gaps in the history, all of that. However, credit where credit's due on HBO Max. Yeah, they do have all of them. And that in large part inspired this. I think I was browsing around the DC hub on HBO Max and I was like, oh, like they're all there. And that sort of got me, and I was scrolling through all of them. And that's in large part what kind of sparked this. So yeah, credit to HBO Max. They're all there.
Shout out to, I'm not on their payroll, but I'm a big fan of HBO Max. There's a lot of great stuff on there. Exactly.
So again, if you go on HBO Max, there are 10 seasons. That's how they're broken down there. But again, most listings have 9 listed. But so I did watch the first episode that introduced Firestorm. One thing that's cool about that episode is it's one of the only instances, there are a couple, where you actually see Clark Kent. He's with Lois and they're down on the street and I think the Daily Planet globe is falling and he excuses himself to go save it. But then Firestorm shows up and transforms the globe into like a tiny balloon. But
typical science.
They do give his origin and they do explain that he is spliced. He and Professor Stein do merge to form Firestorm, and they do state that, they are engaging in this scientific calculation. So it's there, but I don't,
where's Professor? I didn't see Professor Stein in any of the stuff that we saw though, right? On our official watch list. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think there's one other time, but I think that might've been another bonus episode that I watched. I think there's like one other time where you see, with the head, like that he's, that he's having the conversation with, but again, it's very rare. Like you said, in the Superman-centric ones that we watched with Firestorm, it's just Firestorm. You don't get the sense that Professor Stein is in there. And again, even when he is, not that I'm expecting them to get so specific with the science, but it just felt like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, somebody please tell me what the scientific equation is to turn like that giant metal Daily Planet globe into a balloon. I would love to hear what that chemical and scientific process is.
Yeah, it just felt too much, like it's too easy of an out in a show that is no stranger to a Deus Ex Machina. It's like, this was too much.
Their MO. Yeah, right.
But in any event, so we do see this evolution, this progression of the teen, the younger the younger characters. And I think from, Wendy and Marvin to the Wonder Twins to Cyborg and Firestorm, we do get a nice improvement along the way.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And I'm a well-established big Titans fan as well too. So I was super happy to see Cyborg in there. That original outfit though is something, huh? He's come a long way with the outfits over the years, I guess, as so many characters have.
And just jumping back to the voices for a second, Ted Knight as the narrator, and
yes,
the classic, iconic Meanwhile at the Hall of Justice. I
always love him from Caddyshack. I know he's been in a million different things as well too, but yes, that's a good call as well too. Ted Knight, somebody who we're both aware of too, doing that iconic narration. Yeah.
Meanwhile at the Hall of Justice. It's so iconic. That's probably what I'm going to title this episode, but it's just so funny because it's so unnecessary, but it's just a part of the show. It's like they're showing you the Hall of Justice.
We know, what else could that be? What else could that building possibly be? It's not Sears. We know what it is.
But it's so much like I don't know how much, like Silver Age in particular you've read, but it's so like that, where they would show you what's happening and the character would say what's happening and the caption would explain what's happening. So it's like, it's perfect.
Check. Yeah.
Yeah. As far as the animation, I mean, what was your take on it generally? I mean, it certainly. Well, what was your take?
I thought for the time period and the era, I thought it was fine. I thought it was completely fine. I will say this, and I feel like I keep going back to Batman on the Superman podcast. I apologize, but I love, especially in the later seasons, when we get to that more of that iconic 80s Batman look. I thought he looked dynamite. I really, really did. I thought he looked like $1 million, but overall, I'd say it was fine. I mean, they did the job of establishing that these looks are what you would find in the comics. Even Cyborg's look, that's his original look you'd find in the pages of Teen Titans or elsewhere of that time period. So it made sense. At least it was accurate. And, we always talk about this, that some of the main goals of these shows should also be to get people to go and pick up a comic book. And I think they deserve credit for that at least as well, too. I thought it was fine. I didn't see anything too egregious. This is going to sound probably a little unfair, but my bar was also very low for this because just, it started in the 70s. I know coming from Superman, the animated series, like it's not fair to make a comparison. It's not fair to make a comparison. So I'm not here to give any cheap shots. I thought for the time period that it was perfectly fine. I didn't usually see something that made me go, oh, that's, usually that came from a choice that was made from the writing or elsewhere. But no, I had no problem with the art style or the animation, really.
I think I'm mostly with you. Yeah, as far as the animation itself, is it as dynamic or fluid as what we've gotten in more modern times? No, but it certainly works. It certainly works for what it is. And I will say, as far as the designs, I mean, these are very, again, simple, but clean and classic and colorful takes on the characters. And when you get to the point of the superpowers line, and again, in those later seasons, the title of the show would reflect that Kenner superpowers line of action figures to have that tie-in.
Yep.
And I love that line so much. My chair is kind of blocking it, but I've got the ones that I have are on the table behind me there. I have a lot of affection for that line of action figures, and both the figures and the designs from the show, I think, were really classic takes.
I'm going to go back on my word a little bit here and say I do have one major glaring complaint. And this is the only one I can think of, at least off the top of my head, egregiously. Where, dear listeners, Anthony, everybody, where are Hal Jordan's eyes when he's wearing the Green Lantern mask? Did you notice that his eyes were just skin colored? Like flesh colored, and there were no actual eyeballs when you were watching it.
Oh, I didn't even clock that. I'll have to go back and look.
And that was the one thing where I was just like, where are his eyes? Like, I don't understand. Like, it just really took me out of it whenever I saw that. That was the one thing I was like, something I think slipped by in post here, maybe. But other than that, no, I didn't have a problem.
Fair enough. And we talked about, and don't worry, we'll get into the specific episodes as we approach the hour mark here, but we're getting there.
Yeah, well, they know what to expect from us by now.
That's how we go over here. But there are also a number of original creations. I mean, in addition to the Wonder Twins and the other sidekicks, but a number of original creations: Apache Chief, Samurai, Black Vulcan, and El Dorado, the main ones. I'm kind of two minds, right? Because as I'm watching them, they hit a lot of the notes of a stereotypical depiction of members of those ethnicities. El Dorado in particular is calling everyone amigos, left and right. Although they are the super friends and they call themselves friends, but nevertheless, it's, very on the nose and that stereotypical depiction. But in fairness, because I do think the context is always important, and the fact that, and I want to get your take on this, but I think the fact that decades ago, I mean, the show is old at this point.
Yeah.
The fact that there was this effort to incorporate other characters, from other ethnicities, I do think that was an admirable effort. I think in the execution, I think for the times, that they sort of did the best that they could. I mean, again, it definitely left something to be desired, but I thought that the fact that they even made that effort was commendable. What was your take?
I am probably the whitest person any of you know. So I'm not from a position of authority, or would I ever presume to have a conversation about how this affected the various groups of the time that they were attempting to represent. They were very broad strokes, and I know that sometimes unintentionally that can be hurtful to groups as well too. And I don't want to dismiss that. And I want to just acknowledge that as well too, that they certainly could have done better with our lenses here in 2022. To steal your line, that being said, I think you are right where an attempt was made. Maybe it wasn't the best attempt, but there was at least an attempt at inclusion. And I am not up on the metrics of 70s and early 80s cartoons and medias and television shows on all of them. But I would imagine that inclusion was not as pervasive as it is and should have been all along. So at least I think they deserve a cautious nod to say at least an attempt was made. However, again, I'm not a member of any of these groups. And even I, sitting here, can see how those broad strokes can still be hurtful and harmful.
Well said. I echo all of that, and I appreciate the nuance that you added there. I think you hit on a lot of really important points. But yeah, I mean, those were sort of the thoughts that I had as I was watching those. So, kind of an interesting wrinkle with the show there. But okay, favorite episode, especially of the Superman-centric ones. I know you love the Batman origin episode, but of the Superman ones, what was the favorite?
Death of Superman. Gotta be. It told the best. There were moments in other episodes that I might have enjoyed more, like a particular moment. But in terms of an overall intriguing story, I think I have to give the nod to almost at the end of the run there, right? To Death of the Superman. Talk about our thesis on how it gets better as it goes along. I think that's a great example of that.
Yes. I mean, you would think I would have had an answer ready to go here. That one is... No, I think I have a different answer. Although that one is up there for me. Look, anything called The Death of Superman, I'm instantly going to gravitate towards it.
I'll lay up. Sure.
And there's a lot of really good stuff. All right. So that's definitely a contender.
I think I know what yours is going to be, but I'm curious.
I really liked Darkseid's Golden Trap.
Ooh, okay.
I liked the Gold Kryptonite.
That's not what I think your number one's going to be,
It's not the number one. I think it's not any of the Krypton episodes, and it's not any of the Bizarro Mixie episodes.
Tell me it's the one with the best cold open in the show, right? It's the far-flung alternate universe.
No,
we go back in time. No, it's not. I thought that was going to be your favorite. Really?
That one's up there, but I actually think look, like it matters.
You got me at the edge of my seat here. I'm intrigued. I'm so intrigued. This is wonderful.
And I like this, like it really matters, but I think it's Lex Luthor Strikes Back.
Really interesting.
I think it's that one.
Why?
You know what I thought? I don't know if this is going to sound like much of a compliment, but you know what I thought of when I was watching it? Remember in Anchorman, bear with me, but when they have that big brawl with all the other newscasters and everything.
That escalated quickly.
Yeah. And that's what I was thinking as I was watching this, because it's like, Lex escapes and he has this device that allows him to change his appearance, and he uses it to lure the Super Friends into all of these death traps. And then he summons these sun beings who turn the sun red. And I was just like, and then they turn on him. And I was just like, this episode is so
bananas.
wild.
Yeah, it is bananas. You're right about that.
and Superman needs the Supermobile to stop them, and he's got those rods that are able to neutralize the sun.
What's your favorite part of the Supermobile, and why is it the arms that also have gloves on them for some reason that come out of that shit?
Going back to the superpowers line, I have two of the Superman figures. One is still in its packaging. The other one is open and missing a cape. I have the Clark Kent, which was a mail away. I've got, what do I have? I have a Desaad, a Brainiac, a Hawkman, a Flash, a Green Lantern, a Dr. Fate. I think that's it. I never had the Supermobile.
See, I knew you were a Dr. Fate fan. I always, you know what I mean? I knew it deep down.
Deep down. But yeah, no, the Superman, I don't know. I really think, I kind of think that episode, I mean, I liked that. The history of Doom is definitely up there. And this was another thing that was so funny to me. And I wonder if you had a similar experience. I really thought that the Legion of Doom loomed much larger throughout the series of Super Friends, and that it wasn't a one season thing.
Yes, I was surprised, but I also think the show is better for it.
Oh, really?
I think the show's better for it. Yeah. I liked it more because it was as close as this show gets to like those threads of continuity that I feel like we don't have, which is one of the things that we loved so much about Superman, the animated series, right? Those threads of continuity, but it also adds more personal stakes, right? Because yes, it's the Legion of Doom versus the Super Friends or the Superpowers or the Justice League or the Justice League of America, whatever you want to call them, whatever we're calling them that particular season. They're already established relationships there. So to me, that's always more intriguing, right? Because there's more history and more stakes involved. So I at least appreciated that.
Yeah, no, totally. But like I said, that was the thing that I was just surprised by. But I can see why that challenge of the Super Friends season was so, so formative for so many fans watching this, and why you see the Legion of Doom come back in various forms. I mean, they weren't called the Legion of Doom in Justice League Unlimited, but that's effectively what they were.
Same base and everything, right?
Exactly.
The shout out. Yeah. Yeah. That conversation, by the way, in this show, in Challenge of the Super Friends, I think it is, when they're debating like where to put their base, and they're all like, and Lex is like, we'll put it in a swamp. That killed me. Yeah. That really tickled me. It's like Sinestro, I think, is debating with him as well too. Like, where are we going to put this base? He's like, we'll stick it in the swamp. Yeah. That made me laugh.
It was great. Well, because they all wanted something a little bit different. So like that was the compromise.
Yeah, I love it. It's a very Lex on brand thing. Because in my mind, he's going like, all of you want to fight about it? I'm just going to go ahead and stick it in the swamp.
The least favorite of the ones that we watched? Rokan.
Yeah. We started off rough, man. And again, I keep going back to the thesis that it just gets better and better. Oh boy, I got to be real careful with my words here because I don't want to sound like I'm dumping on it because it does get better. But I struggle to find anything of real tangible merit that came from that episode. Right. And it also somehow accomplished the horrible task of like further complicating and I think diluting Krypton and Superman's history a little bit. For no reason. Like, why are there dinosaurs flying around and stuff like that too? And like it survived somehow and now it's come back here. It was too much. It was too much. And for what? And then the dinosaur is reproducing asexually and is laying eggs, and Batman and Robin are fighting these babies. Is that ethical? I don't know. And just the whole thing just was a mess, to be honest with you, I think.
Yeah, that one was pretty rough. Although we were talking off mic, my son, my 2.5-year-old son, loves dinosaurs. So that's one that I will show him. And,
who doesn't? Yeah, there you go.
And maybe he'll get something out of it. Yeah, that one was pretty rough. Well, while we're talking Krypton, we touched on this before, but the time travel, right? Superman gets sucked through this black hole, and he arrives at Krypton shortly before its destruction, and we get to see poor Jor-El, as he always is, pleading with the council.
That's a tragic but kind of cool consistency that we've seen because not only through animation, but just from our journey of all of the origins of Superman as well too. That certainly is a constant.
Are we being too hard on Superman though for not even considering that there might be some ramifications to the timeline, or should it have at least crossed his mind?
So here's the thing. This is going to sound like a silly nitpick maybe, but I would have been okay with everything if he was just like I have to be careful. Like what happens here, I could mess up the future. Like I need to be really, really careful, but then just have him be so overcome with emotion that he gives in and does it anyway. We can all relate to that. Who's to say that we wouldn't do something similar in that position? That's fine. What we got instead was, well, I'm back. I'm going to go ahead and just make things the way I want it. And that's where I think it rubbed me the wrong way. It's like, man, you have Flash on the team. Like, I just at least talk to him a little bit for a minute and just be like, hey, what are the do's and don'ts here? You know, as I'm time traveling and messing with the space-time continuum.
Yes, I agree. You know, especially with all of the time travel stories we've seen, it's just like, oh man, this seems like such a no-brainer. But, you know, it was cool. It was really cool to see Krypton prior to its destruction and to see him there. Sure. I agree with you. It just would have made the episode a lot more compelling if it even crossed his mind and he was, you know, made this decision like, well, no, I have to save this entire planet. But, you know, you do have, you know, it's you know, sad when he has to go back and then undo the save. So that was one of the segments.
He also he showed no emotion of being affected by it after too. He's just like, oh, for me, it was a lifetime.
Yeah.
And he just like smiles and goes away. It's like, is Superman is he having a mental breakdown here? Like, is he okay? Like, this is like some disassociation going on. I don't know if he's okay in that episode.
Well, think about how many times he just went through a black hole. He went through a black hole like 4 times, but you know, back and forth twice.
Now, see, if that was the start of a whole arc of being like, guys, I think something's wrong with Superman, that would have been amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm Monday morning quarterbacking here, of course, but yeah, that would have been interesting.
Yeah. I know that's the thing. And look, I know, I'm sure we'll continue to do it. I think it's natural, but yes, we recognize this was, you know, made at a certain time for a certain audience.
Of course.
But at the same time, I don't know. It's still an interesting thought exercise because, you know, something like that. Yeah. I mean, that probably would have been beyond the scope of what the show, you know,
sure. But at least give me that. There's 5 to 10 seconds of him being conflicted about it. That would have made it so much better for me.
That would have. One of the things, I think you and I talked about this off mic when we did our tech check a few weeks ago, but it was cool to see how many of the DC Universe cast members they utilize, but also just elements of the DC Universe. The fact that we get red and blue, of course, green, gold kryptonite. We see the Fortress of Solitude.
They're all there. It's all there, which is really, really cool. And, you know, that's also why Superman is the best lens. Obviously, I'm in good company and agreeing with this here, but why this podcast is living, breathing proof of that. Why Superman is the best lens, right, for the wider DC universe, because, you know, it starts with him and it kind of all connects and goes through him. And it's so cool. We see that reflected in the Super Friends, because I would argue that more so than any other character. And again, we saw the Superman-centric episode, so I'm not an authority, but I can't imagine any other character gets as many comic book shout outs based on what you just said alone, right? Which is kind of really, really cool to see. So they definitely did their homework and they were really trying to honor the source material. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, the varieties of kryptonite, the fortress, seeing Krypton, the time travel to Smallville, to Superboy.
Yep.
You know, you get a lot of that, which is really cool. And again, multiple members of the Superman Rogues Gallery. So yeah, I do think Superman gets more than his fair share of the spotlight. And I think is treated well in the show as far as, you know, everything that's sort of, you know, woven in there. So
yeah,
that's a big positive. We see Superman affected by red kryptonite a few times.
Mm-hmm.
We see when Bizarro uses it on him the first time, he grows extra arms and legs. On Bizarro World, it turns him into this weakling. The Phantom Zone criminals use it on him and makes him an old man. What was your favorite of the red kryptonite takes?
And I will counter that question with another question. In the universe of the Super Friends, what does red kryptonite do?
Something different every time.
And see, that to me, even it's of a different era, that question should have been posed to somebody somewhere. Bizarro World, it should have the opposite effect. I get that. I'm with you on that. That's fine. I'm cool and I'm with it. But that's storytelling, right? That's just, to me, I don't want to say it's basic storytelling because it sounds like I'm really stomping on them here, but like just the fact that it does something different every time. It's like, And it's so hard for me to be invested. And like you said, the show is notorious for its Deus Ex Machinas. It's also notorious for their just quick magic MacGuffins. And that's kind of what this is. We need we need something to happen to Superman. How can we do it? Just bust out some red kryptonite. Just bust out any kryptonite we got. Just throw it at him and we'll just make it do. He'll grow extra arms and legs. Sure, he'll be an octopus Superman now. Why not? Totally fine. And just a little things like that. If there was just some continuity, like it makes him old, fine. Even if they just decided it was something silly, like growing the extra arms and legs, sure, fine. Just have it. It does that here. And then maybe in Bizarro World, he has no arms and legs. Like, I don't know. But just the basic consistency was lacking. That really bothered me.
It's funny. I didn't mind it. And I feel like you might expect that it would bug me. But as I understand it, I think that's how the comics treated it too, pre-crisis, like whatever. Sure. It was something different every time. Probably for me, the most formative take on red kryptonite in my fandom, big surprise here, is Smallville, where it removed.
You like that show?
It's okay. No.
It's okay. There you go.
But there it removed his inhibitions, made him bad boy Clark every time. So that's always what I have in my mind. So it's definitely.
I don't disagree with you though, because I think that's infinitely more interesting than anything we saw here.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying.
Right?
That's the take on it I prefer, where there is more consistency, and that's the effect that it has. And it certainly lent itself very well to a lot of very fun episodes and moments on Smallville. But especially in the context of this animated series, I mean, yes, it's so convenient and but I don't know. It didn't bother me. And of the various ones, I'm hard pressed to say if I have a favorite. The one that was, I guess, maybe the funniest to me was when he's turned into the Weakling on Bizarro World, and then apparently the radiation through his cape is able to turn it blue, right? That was that
was written 4:59 on a Friday, I think, is what happened there. With, again, all due respect, I actually thought if I have to choose one, I think when he grows old, just because I thought that was like a surprisingly dark plan, right? That like, we're going to keep you alive to watch destroy everything you love and your planet, everything like that. Surprisingly dark for this show, like really kind of dastardly.
It was. Now, not to nitpick, but in that episode, well, no, in the Bizarro episode where he has the extra arms and legs, he's like, oh, this will just wear off in a few hours.
Yeah.
But in the one where he turns old, those effects do not reverse at all. He has to go into space in the Supermobile and get blue kryptonite.
With the robot arms with the gloves on them.
Remind me, does he leave it there?
I think he does.
Because I remember as I was watching
he leaves it floating there. Yeah, in the debris.
Maybe you want to take this with you in case you run into red kryptonite again.
I guess the reoccurring question I have throughout the show is Superman okay? Is he okay is what I want to know. Oh, goodness gracious. There's room on that thing, right? Just, stick it in there. Have the little gloves hold it. Be fine.
Yeah. And we also we see the fortress in that first Bizarro episode, but we also see it when the quote unquote General Zod escapes the Phantom Zone and turns the sun red, and Superman needs the help of Aquaman and Green Lantern to penetrate the fortress. So that was cool. So I love seeing the fortress. So I was happy to see that.
Yeah, no. And again, that's just, I think further reaffirms what we've been saying about how much love Superman and his mythos and his history gets in this show. We see the fortress a few times, at least in the episodes we saw. Who knows if it even pops up again, but it definitely was prevalent, especially with, it plays a big, big factor, as we already touched upon with the Death of Superman episode as well. So it was cool to see.
And we see Superboy twice in the episodes that we watch. I mean, in particular, what did you think of the origin of Luthor?
I messaged you, if you remember, and I was like, oh, I missed it. So a little inside baseball. I messaged Anthony the GIF from Back to the Future, which I also love, of Michael J. Fox going, oh, I've seen this one before. It's a classic. And it's that same age old story almost that if you'd read comics or were aware from comics from a certain era and of that age, that you'd pick up on right away, even down to, losing the hair. And it did have that element that both you and I enjoy, to an extent, right? Where like they did have kind of like that existing relationship, which I thought was kind of cool in Smallville as well. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a pretty cool nod to the history and everything that came before.
Yeah, I was impressed by how closely it stuck to the comic book story. I mean, the Silver Age origin of Luthor that we get in Adventure Comics is, I mean, beat for beat, essentially what you get in that Super Friends cartoon. I mean, it's, you know, do I like that it all boils down to, you know, Luthor blaming Superboy for his baldness? No, not necessarily, but yeah, I agree with you. And look, again, this whole idea of how these iterations build upon each other. You get to the Smallville TV show and you have years of them having this great friendship that deteriorates. So, you know, what you get in a few pages or a few minutes in this cartoon is a lot faster and more superficial, but it still has that bedrock of, you know, Luthor is a fan of Superboy and saves him from kryptonite. They forge this friendship.
Yep. And that's the most devastating part of all, not the hair, right? When you see that he's like a huge fan of Superboy, that to me was the best part of that whole storytelling there. Right.
Yeah.
Cause that's, you understand like why he's so hurt. Right. You know, that explains so much more than even just the hair. So I thought that was cool. And you're right. It plants those seeds as well too, to see it get further, you know, in Smallville and so many other different pieces of media and mediums as well too. That relationship expanded and explored. So yeah, that was really cool.
Yes. I mean, still to me, the weirdest part of this is that, you know, he has this whole shrine to Superboy and, you know, Superboy is very flattered by it, but I feel like a more appropriate reaction would have been like, I gotta go.
Yeah. Oops. I'm needed somewhere across town. Right.
Yeah. But, you know, it's cool to see Luthor in this series. And this is not the 90s evil businessman that, you know, we grew up on, but I can totally get on board with this incarnation of Lex in the, you know, the purple and green outfit, and then later the war suit in the episode where he teams up with Darkseid. In the war suit,
that he has the war suit. I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I don't know the exact date where that first made an appearance, like off the top of my head, of course. But when I saw that, I was like, wow, there's something that's still being used in comics to this day, which is super cool to kind of see it on this show.
Yeah, it was cool. Oh, that's actually the other figure that I have from the Superpowers line of him in that war suit. And then
that's awesome.
Then you see it on the show. So you get that tie in there, but it's cool. And obviously you see him as the leader of the Legion of Doom. You get his origin. And there's one episode that I didn't include for us, but I did watch it. It was in the Challenge of the Super Friends season where Luthor's like, I've discovered the secret origins of the Super Friends. And then they use time travel to basically stop each of them from becoming who they are. So like they divert Superman's rocket to another planet that doesn't have a yellow sun. And
I like this so far.
And I think it's Luthor takes the place of Hal Jordan and gets transported to Abinsur's ship. So it's like, Cheetah takes...
That's got legs. That's got legs.
Yeah, Cheetah is able to insert herself into the contest on Paradise Island and become Wonder Woman instead of Diana.
Of course.
It was a cool episode. And like I said, clearly a standout for me was that, the Luthor Strikes Back episode where he really gets the spotlight there and escapes from prison. And his lair looks just like his subterranean hideout from Superman the movie. And he's got this sidekick. I think his name is Orville, but it's very clearly Otis.
I miss Mercy,
Yeah, no Mercy, no Miss Tessmacher. I know, but it was cool. I definitely enjoyed. Yeah, I enjoyed Luthor on the show, I would say.
Yeah, me too. Overall, I appreciated him, and it's funny. I wonder if I would have appreciated him as much as I do now had I not been already many, many, many hours deep into research and podcasting with you and everything we've covered already too. But I definitely, I agree. I thought it was especially of the time and of the era, I have no problem with that. And, that episode was bananas, but it wasn't bad. It was entertaining. And it showed Lex Luthor's delusions of grandeur and just like huge concept thinking, which is always very interesting, if nothing else.
Yeah, and it's not the only instance. We also see this in the No Honor Among Thieves segment where he teams up with Darkseid, and these instances where he makes these alliances, whether with those sun demons or with Darkseid, and then he ends up needing the help of the Super Friends.
Yeah,
and is willing to do that
we also see down the road too, in some moments in Superman the Animated Series. You and I have talked about how we love that. when, Clark and Lex, this, obviously to a greater extent, the whole Super Friends, but when they are forced to work together is always extremely interesting.
Yes. Can we talk about Darkseid? There's a very different take on Darkseid in this show.
Yes, there sure was. Again, I'm going to answer your question with another question. What was Darkseid's motivation throughout this show?
To marry Wonder Woman.
Like, that's ridiculous and gross, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, right? That's ridiculous.
Well, it's even worse because, I watched, this wasn't on our list, but I watched the first episode that introduced Darkseid. I think that was the same one that introduced Firestorm. It's blurring together, so forgive me if I've mixed anything up. But that's when he first sets his sight on Wonder Woman, and he creates this like personality altering machine to strip her of her free will.
I mean, dude, not cool, man.
It's not cool. It's so like, obviously, like that would never play now, rightfully so.
Right.
But it was just, look, I've read and watched a lot of Darkseid stories.
Sure.
And I can't think of any others, and maybe I haven't read and watched everything, so if maybe it's out there. But I'm hard pressed to think of anything else where romance, if you even want to call it that, is even in the equation for him. No pun intended.
Right.
But
I like it.
So it was so weird for that to be not even part of his motivation, but seemingly the motive. I mean, look, he still wants world domination and all of that, but it was not so much about the anti-life equation. It was really
about Wonder Woman.
It was so weird.
And that aside, yes, first and foremost, being gross and wrong and rightfully would not fly today, it just diminishes the character so much, right? It just diminishes what's supposed to be this S tier of not just Superman, but DC crisis level villain. It just diminishes that character so incredibly much to me.
Yeah, it was unfortunate. However, I was pleasantly surprised by two things. In fairness, one was, Darkseid had not been around all that long when he made his Super Friends or Superpowers at that point debut.
Is that right? When I don't, I'm not asking you to know a date off the top of your head, but he was created, I'm guessing early 1970s then?
1970. Yeah.
How about that? Look at that. Okay.
So, I mean, look, we're talking 14, 15 years. That's not nothing, but at the same time, it's not like, he's been around for decades. Right. So it was cool that he had already made the jump to the small screen. And in terms of the vocal performance and those he surrounded himself with, specifically Kalibak and Desaad. I mean, it's
some familiar faces for us.
That's the thing. I mean, it didn't feel all that divorced from the modern
I thought his
version.
voice was great.
Yeah.
Just as a sidebar, I thought his voice was fantastic in the show. Yeah, definitely very menacing. And you're right. He has the usual suspects with him. It's just that the whole Wonder Woman thing just really throws the whole thing off kilter.
I know, it was such a weird choice.
They're out there stealing Wonder Woman robots, trying to take them home. The whole thing is just messed up, man.
I know. It's, again, through a modern lens, certainly, but also just odd in that, as far as I know, I mean, it's just so removed from what we typically think of with Darkseid. I mean, I'd be curious as to how that was received back in the day. People probably didn't really that much of an eye at that. Yeah.
Yeah, you're probably right. But it's and again, it's of an era. That's one of the things that we get painfully reminded of sometimes when watching the show.
Yes. But like I said, I really did like the Gold Kryptonite episode. It was surprising to me that they spent so much time at the auction.
Yeah, like a lot of time at the auction.
Yeah, so it's like this intergalactic underworld auction, and the big ticket item is a piece of gold kryptonite, which, as the characters know and we know, can strip Superman of his powers permanently, right? Famously, in Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow.
That's right.
Superman exposes himself to gold kryptonite and then secretly lives out his life as a normal man with Lois and their son. But yeah, so much that's really basically the first act of that episode is Darkseid getting his hands on the gold kryptonite, and then the second half is kind of this chase, and a fun enough payoff where Batman and Superman switch places, right? So Darkseid thinks he's exposing Superman, but we've seen
that one before too.
Yeah,
which is kind of fun, right? kind of like a nod. It makes me really wonder, I really feel like people are watching and paying attention to what's come before when I see these thematic kind of connections or different spins on things that we've seen before. So I thought it was cool. I also got like slight Ocean's 11 vibes a little bit, which was kind of fun, right? They're all like, trying to, see what's going on with this auction. It definitely was a different tone in a good way, I thought, to some of that episode than what we had seen before.
Yes. I think I know the answer to this, but seeing that, it really appears, like you said, that the Bruce Timm, the people who worked on the Bruce Timm shows clearly took some level of inspiration from what came before.
Yeah.
Like I said, I think I know the answer, but does it diminish your appreciation of the Timmverse at all, that you're like, hey, like all the stuff we thought they were coming up with, maybe they just took their cues from what came before?
Not at all, because, and again, I'm just going to be blunt and honest, they made it better. They made it better, because you could go back and to the Super Friends show. I'm sure there are people who are just like, oh yeah, well in the comics this happened and it was better than that. And when these things go on for as long as they did, they're always going to be iterative of something at this point, right? It's how you can make it your own, how you can make it more nuanced, how you can maybe take that same scene or idea and approach it from a different angle that we hadn't seen before.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. Yeah, it definitely doesn't take away from it. Yeah, if anything, I think it just, like I said, it just gives you more of an understanding of how all of these things sort of flow into each other.
To me, it's a nice nod of the cap, a little bit too,
What'd you think of the Universe of Evil episode where Superman and his evil counterpart switch places?
That might have been, in a show with campiness, that might have been the most campy one to me of the lot. Just like seeing all of them in their outfits. And it's like, I didn't hate it. It was almost something that it was so silly to me at some points that it was like inoffensive. It crossed over to me being like, okay, I can at least see and appreciate like what we're going for here. This is talk about something that's been done before in iterative, like so many times in the comics and everything else, the evil doppelganger trope, of course. But yeah, I mean, it's fine when they're like, oh, why is your outfit so strange? I was going to ask you the same thing. Like it's silly, but maybe it's because I've seen it so many times before and I understand immediately what's happening. I at least have some base level of appreciation for what they tried to do. I thought it was very campy. I thought it was very silly at some points, but I at least appreciate what they were going for.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it calls to mind the Brave New Metropolis episode from Superman the Animated Series.
There you go. That's exactly right. Which again, better.
What actually, I don't know if impressed is the right word, but I thought it was cool how that episode ends on this note of, Superman made this promise to the scientist who helped him get back to his Earth that, he would save them from the tyranny of the evil Super Friends. Right. And so it ends with him basically telling the Super Friends, like, we have to go help these people. And that's how the episode ends. And there's never any follow up to that. But I thought, which I don't know, maybe you could look at it as a failing, but I thought it was kind of cool that it's like, okay, we know that there's going to be this further adventure. We're not necessarily going on it with them, but it was one of the only ones I can think of where it wasn't like everything wasn't totally wrapped up in a little bow.
Yes.
So,
and I was about to hit more negative on that, but when you frame it like that, I actually think that is a completely fair point, right? Because I think that I don't like when things happen off camera, off panel, off screen. I want to experience them. I want to be there on the journey, but there is something to be said in a show that is notorious for wrapping things up in a nice little bow that this isn't. That's a little bit more like real life, right? There are always loose ends. There's always something else to do. Were they successful? Are they still to this day trying to save those scientists? So I think that's definitely very noteworthy from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that, that more than anything in that episode stood out to me where I was like, oh, that's kind of a different way to end. I wouldn't necessarily expect that, especially based on what had come before. So, I was cool with that. The one small step for Superman where he helps the child. Yeah, you were less enamored with that one.
You people who have listened to us for a while now are going to be probably remember me saying this, but I'm always a fan of asking, who is this for? Who is this episode for exactly? I just don't understand what we accomplished here. I think the attempt was that Superman inspires this kid despite his best efforts to conquer not his physical limitations, but his deep-seated mental and emotional limitations. But to me, it seems like he just created this elaborate ruse to lie to a child. And I always think of scenes that bring out the best in Superman, where maybe he's talking to somebody who's standing outside of a ledge of a window thinking about jumping. And he flies up there and he just sits. And of course, I'm paraphrasing here and broad stroking, but hey, you want to talk? That's Superman to me. Not this, not creating this whole ruse and going to his friends after being like, see, wink, wink. He can walk the whole time. He's got to throw a giant robot at him. Also, there's no way he could have known that would have worked. That kid could have died. And again, my question of the episode, is Superman okay? In the Super Friends, is he okay? That black hole really did a number on him, I think.
I know. I feel like there's this like whole take on the show that we could have where it's like, if you really look at it through this different lens of Superman really maybe not being okay, like how that would color all of the episodes.
This is an Injustice prequel, right?
No,
is what this is slowly turning out to be.
What other episodes or aspects of the show haven't we hit on yet that you wanted to?
It sounds like I'm being primarily negative on it. And that, again, I want to just remind everybody that there is a lot to like. You kind of hit the nail on the head right at the beginning when you said that in terms of like the adult heroes, like their personalities are for the most part interchangeable. We see a little more with Batman in that episode that we both enjoyed, certainly. But I still think, to me, there was something so cool on a fundamental, simplest level of seeing Green Lantern, Aquaman, not just Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, but seeing all these heroes together, right? It's why we love Justice League and Justice League Unlimited so much, right? That we see that they're part of this larger world. So I think that alone is just a tremendous positive. I was psyched to see Green Lantern in there. I thought that was really cool as well, too. I feel like he doesn't have a lot to do in the episodes we watched necessarily. Usually he's swooping in and doing crowd control, I feel like. But it was still cool to have him there. It was cool to have all of these characters. My big problem, and to recenter it, because this is a Superman podcast, to recenter it, I always like to look at things through the critical lens of who Superman is and what we can learn about him from this. And we learn a bunch of facts about Superman from this, right? We learn about the Fortress of Solitude. We see Lois Lane. We, one time at least, maybe more, we see Clark, the Daily Planet we see, and so on. We see Krypton. We see Smallville. We see all of these facts that pay great homage to the source material. What's lacking, as much as I joke about is Superman okay, is it, to me, it's missing that the most important part, that his greatest superpower of his ethics and his compassion over more than just like a surface level. And I think, to me, probably, maybe I'm biased from having done this with you for a while now, right? That I've seen so many good Superman stories in comics and in animation and film and everywhere, where you really see that the best parts of him are the human parts that relate to people, that shine. And we don't ever get, and that this One Small Step episode could have been that episode. It could have been like, this is the best Superman, Super Friends episode ever. He talks to this kid about not having fear and about how, he felt alone when he first came to this planet and he needed people to help him. Hey, guess what? I'm Superman. Look around me. I need help. I can't do this by myself. It's okay for you to ask for help too. And that's what we needed, not tricking them with giant robots. And I think that's my fundamental problem.
It's so funny to me because I feel like I'm almost surprised that I don't feel the same way. And I feel like audience members who have heard me complain about other takes on Superman might also be surprised, because it's true. And we said this before, this is not a show really about any internal tension,
right,
within any of the characters or among any of the characters. It's really all plot based and it's all external.
Yep.
And like I said, do I think that's the most interesting or the most compelling? No, of course not. But I guess I just, maybe this is somewhat of a result of going in with what I think were ultimately pretty realistic expectations of what this show was going to be.
Sure.
And I think just accepting like this is what it is. I don't know. And so it didn't really bother me as much as maybe it did for you, or as much as you might think it would for me.
And I think that's why I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, because you're right. There is, despite all of the flaws and all the nitpicks and all the storytelling and all the consistency problems and all of the glove on robot hands and not knowing what red kryptonite does, despite all of that, there is a certain inherent and infectious joy baked into this show. And I think that I want to just admit that and say that as well, too. On that front, I do agree with you. I do see it and I do acknowledge it, right? Because this is something that if you were a kid of the time period, you could pop this on a Saturday morning and probably have the time of your life and then spend the rest of the day zooming around like your favorite super friend. And that is special. And that is real cool. And there's no way that me sitting here on my high horse in 2022 really has any right to take that away from anybody, and nor would I presume to. I think that's special and it's valid and it's important. And I think it's fair to say, based on what we saw, all of the other DC animation and stories that I like, we might not have gotten if not for the Super Friends. So that being said, I am thankful and I think they're important. I think there's a difference between being important and being of a quality that I enjoy on a more cerebral level. I think those are two very different things. But it's important and it's joyful. And that I will definitely agree with.
Yeah, I think for whatever reason, maybe it was that comparison to Power Rangers. Maybe it was, again, just being in the mood for something a little easier. But the word I do keep coming back to is simple. And I don't say that as a knock, but there is a real simplicity to the show while still tapping into, again, I think very classic representations of the characters. The most interesting and nuanced? No. But still very classic. Like you can show this to anybody and it's like, these are the characters. And yeah, I mean, I'm glad that, again, I feel like this was kind of unusual for me, but I'm really glad that I was able to just enjoy it for what it was. Now, one criticism of Superman that I always butt up against and I always disagree with is this idea that Superman is boring or a dud. You look at a show like this, but I feel like what you could say, anything you could say about Superman.
He's not boring in this show. He's having a mental breakdown.
But also it's like, I think any criticism along those lines that you could level against Superman, it applies to everyone in the show.
Yeah, again, those are lazy insults, and the whoever says that does not have enough experience with any of the countless wonderful stories in various mediums that explore that character. Full stop. That's it.
Yeah, but like I said at the top, this is a Superman who just always knows what to do, and is always willing to do it, and is Superman because he's Superman, and it just is what it is. So. Yeah, so I guess that's the thing. It's not like I was trying to enjoy this from that more cerebral perspective. I think if I were trying to do that, yes, it would be lacking. I think I tried to approach this from more of an emotional standpoint of like what this would have been like to watch as a kid, or what it was like for the people, who are older than us who watched this as a kid. I think that was really like my guiding light. And the principle that I just tried to keep in mind as I was watching this, like, okay, we can pick it apart now easily, clearly, but
sure.
What at the time, what effect would it have had at the time? So again, it worked for me. How often would I go back and rewatch these? Probably not very, but would I show them to my son, soon? I think I would. And
sure.
I think it would be a fun, it'd be a fun intro. The music's great. We didn't mention the music, but I love the music.
Yeah, no, the music was good too. We should make a promise at some point to show this both to your son and my daughter and just kind of like get their general notes on it and then share that back. I think that'd be a very interesting project for us.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun. That would be. And, audience, I would love to hear from you. Again, I'm sure there's a mix. I'm sure there's some who've never watched it or had a similar experience that we did when we were kids, and then others who grew up watching it and loved it. So, but it certainly, I think, earned its place in the DC canon. I'm very glad that all of the episodes are available.
Yes.
There are plenty of projects that are not. Not to rant against this, but Adventures of Superman, missing from any streaming service, including HBO Max. So I'm so glad that it's out there, and you got to walk before you can run, right? So when we have had the take on Superman that we got in Superman the Animated Series, where it dealt with more adult themes and it got into more of what makes him tick. If we didn't have this sort of like baseline version to build off of. We haven't talked about this, but we also did a while back we did our Ruby Spears episode, which came right in between.
I was just gonna. It's so funny. Maybe because my mind just jumps to what I think my favorite is. But yes, chronologically speaking, we know what comes next, right? We spent a good amount of time covering what comes next.
Yeah,
and even the differences between those two shows, I don't know. It's something I definitely would have to think about more in terms of just overall which one I enjoyed more. I think to be honest with you, Anthony, I think I might overall, despite everything I said, enjoy the Super Friends and all their subsequent seasons overall, maybe even a little more than the Ruby Spears, just because they had that more variety and more of that joyous kind of madcap celebration. It's something I'd have to think about comparing those two a little more, but it's my gut feeling.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good question. I think my heart ultimately lies more with Super Friends.
Yeah.
But Ruby Spears is, again, we did 2 hours on it so people can listen to that, but
we sure did.
Fascinating entry.
So interesting.
One of the last things, and we can go back to anything that you like, but one of the last things, I know we touched on Bizarro, but I continue to wrestle with my feelings towards Bizarro as a character because I feel like he's really hit or miss. And for me, he's usually more miss than hit.
Sure.
I still think probably one of my very favorite incarnations really was Superman the Animated Series, because I thought that tapped into...
It's the best one.
It's the tragedy. It had.
Yes.
I really think it's had the best balance. All the Bizarros I've seen, it's the best balance between the tragedy and the comedy.
Yep.
And it really, like we talked about it, it really pulls at the heartstrings that he thinks he's Superman. It's heartbreaking.
And I'm for anybody who listened to the mixtapes, thank you. And I'm sorry for repeating myself here, but we were so enamored with that episode because it plays on the idea of Bizarro to something as alien as it might seem. We can all relate to is what happens when we find out we're not who we thought we were. And that is the universal fear and emotion that can help get us grounded into Bizarro. I think that's, to me at least, is the key to that character. And
that's what's like totally missing here. I mean, I am glad that we didn't have to deal with backward speak, which I'm never a fan of, but there's really, as I like to say, there's no meat on the bone here with this Bizarro. He's just a backwards version of Superman who lives on Bizarro World. I like the visual enough, I guess, but I've never been a fan of Bizarro World. I've always thought it was silly. Sorry, but I've never liked it.
Well, because you rob the specialness of the character a little bit too by creating a whole planet, right? That's kind of how I look at it.
100%. And so, between that and, really just not having any aspect of that tragedy to the character, I just don't think he works as well. So, these episodes with Bizarro were okay. I mean, I enjoyed them more because, they brought us to the fortress and they incorporated red and blue kryptonite. Like, I enjoy them more for that than the Bizarro of it.
Those jokes didn't land, huh? About the square wheels and we go through walls instead of doors. It was all very hokey, right?
Yeah, that shtick doesn't really do it for me.
Yeah, me neither. Unsurprisingly.
Now, look, Superman the Animated Series, him mistaking the doorman for Jor-El, one of the funniest things I've ever seen.
Oh. But that's the thing. Those jokes were earned as well too, right? Because it wasn't just like the surface level comedy constantly. So I think that's a big part of it too, right? Those moments you appreciate more because they're in balance with storytelling.
Yeah. I think that's all I got, man. But what else do you want to say about Super Friends?
It's on HBO Max. Don't take our word for it. Go watch it. I would love to have conversations with everybody, whether it's your first time watching it or if you watched it when you were a kid. I would be so curious to hear people's experiences with the show, and I just get some feedback, and maybe more so than anything we've ever covered, because I feel like you and I have such different opinions on the show. I'm so interested and excited to hear what other people think, right? Because I feel like there's still so much I can learn from different people's viewpoints on this show. No matter what, this show is important, integral, and a worthy piece of Superman's history and the larger DC universe's history. I think it's important. Doesn't necessarily mean I think it's good, but I do think it's important. And that alone means that I'm happy I watched it. I'm happy that everybody, can watch it as long as you pay HBO their money. I'm happy that everybody has the ability to watch it, because I think it sounds funny to talk about something that people may have watched when they were kids as like a historical artifact. I'm not trying to age people horribly here, but it really does seem like an important piece of history, regardless of anything else that I nitpick. It does seem like a legitimate, important part of history. So I'm thankful for that.
Yeah, I appreciate everything you said, and don't feel too bad if you didn't enjoy it as much as you wanted to. I definitely know that feeling of wanting to enjoy something,
yep,
and not really getting there, and that's quite all right. But I'm from my perspective, like I said, I think I was able to come at this from a standpoint of accepting it for what it was and being able to enjoy it within that context. But like yourself, I mean, totally appreciate the place that it holds. Like I said at the top, I mean, it was really carried the torch for such a long time. I mean, not to harp on this, but that was, again, one of the things that was so surprising to me was how, what a long span it had.
And they got better. Not only did they just hang in there, but they actively got better. So you got to give them credit for that. You do.
They got better. And clearly, were formative for a lot of fans, but including fans who became creators. Alex Ross did his whole Justice miniseries that was very much in the vein
of
Super Friends. Scott Snyder recently did a whole run on Justice League that took a lot of its cues from that. So it's definitely had, and again, even Justice League Unlimited, though they weren't called Legion of Doom, they for all intents and purposes, that's what we were dealing with. So, it's had a very lasting legacy, and that's not nothing. And again, there's a lot of fun to be had and watching these episodes. So this was not an episode that was originally on my list when I first sat down and mapped out this year. Like I said, it just kind of sprung up on me, and I was like, I feel like we need to do this. And I'm very glad we did. And I appreciate you coming along for this ride.
Oh, me too. I'm so glad we did. And, it's always a pleasure. You just got to give me the signal. I'll come running to the Hall of Justice and we'll make it happen.
Yes. Oh, in closing, I know we touched on it here and there, but yes, the episode, it's called The Fear, correct?
Yes, The Fear, I believe is what it's called.
All right. So in the final season, right? Was the final season episode?
Yeah, it's the final. It's one of the last episodes, I think, right? It's in the last season.
Yes. So this was Scarecrow episode, very Batman centric. You and I were talking off mic. This was intended to be the basis for a separate new Batman animated series.
Yep.
Ended up not happening. It was repurposed as this Super Friends or Superpowers episode. But yeah, the darkest take on Batman that we got in the entirety of Super Friends, definitely one of the darkest episodes generally and most mature.
Yes. I mean, by a country mile, my goodness. Yeah. Talk about storytelling and dark. You get the whole tragic backstory that we've seen. Oh, no pearls fell to the ground this time though. Like, I was waiting for those pearls to fall when the Waynes were coming out of the theater. But yeah, we got to see the whole tragic backstory, but more than that, and this is going to sound overtly simple, but it's the first time that we really saw one of the Super Friends be afraid in a way that was deeply internal and they weren't going to be able to punch their way out of.
Yes.
And that to me makes this my favorite episode that we've seen by just on that alone.
It's a standout. Again, not a Superman episode, but we had to watch it because I've heard about it for years. It's always been on the list of like, oh, one day, we'd love to watch that. Because this was, to my understanding, one of the earliest examples of the origin being told in a different medium.
Yeah.
And yeah, it really does stand apart from the rest of the Super Friends episodes. And yeah, you finally, it's so funny. It's like you get this relatively dark and deep Batman episode. You get the death of Superman, which again, it does, in a very different vein, but you do see the public mourning the loss of Superman, the Super Friends mourning. Again, it is sort of taking things to another level. Even it takes to the final episodes.
The black armbands even they're all wearing was like a very dark touch. I was like, wow. Yeah, they're really going for it here.
I know. I clocked those armbands. I was like, I wonder if that was, a bit of the inspiration for when the actual death of Superman rolled around in the comics. So, it would have been cool if that had launched a Batman animated series.
I would have loved to have watched that. I would have absolutely loved to have watched that. I wonder why that didn't pan out. I'm curious.
Yeah, I don't know. There was also, again, reading on Wikipedia, there was an attempt to do a New Teen Titans spinoff. Yes. Or I don't know if they would have launched it from Super Friends, but it would have been set within the same continuity. I mean, like that would have been really cool to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always down for more Titans.
I know. And that would have been the time, like the period of time for it as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah. In the 80s. Yeah, for sure.
Would have been perfect with the depiction of the Wayne's murder. I was very curious, like how are they going to do this? Cause it's still a Saturday morning about that kids cartoon and
that thunder, right?
The thunder in place of the bullets. Yeah. Which was effective. I don't think that would have scarred the kids who are watching, but still would have had an understanding. And certainly
it's also a nice audio. It's a nice audio cue because then when Batman's going back through it, he's hearing that strike again. So that was a nice connection, I thought.
The saying, right? Constraints make the artist. Like even though they were limited in that sense, it still lent itself really well. That's a great. I hadn't made that connection, but you're right. The fact that the thunder, pulls him right back to that. Yeah, that one really was a standout. So. Yeah, by the time you get to those final couple of seasons with Darkseid, even with all of the weirdness with Wonder Woman, but the Darkseid episodes and the ones that we were just talking about, I think it gets closer to a version of an animated series that you and I would be able to sink our teeth into.
Yes,
more
definitely.
Well, my friend, as always, we've gone just about a couple of hours here, but I so enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure. And thank you to everybody who's always, reaching out and talking to us. And it's a wonderful community we have here. So thank you to everybody who listens, watches, and supports. This is a whole lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, audience. Make sure you come back next time for our next all-new episode of Digging for Kryptonite. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. The spin-off podcast, Digging for Justice, a DC fan journey, is available now exclusively at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, starting at the $1 level. New episodes release monthly, and many more rewards are available too, including a robust back catalog of bonus podcasts. Thank you to all patrons for enabling me to produce this show.